The air in the archives was a dead thing, recycled, filtered, and chilled to the precise temperature required to preserve the brittle data wafers and memory crystals that held the sanitized history of the directorate. Elian breathed it in, a shallow, practiced rhythm that never quite filled his lungs. It was the scent of nothing, the smell of control, and for 7 years it had been the smell of his safety. He ran a gloved finger along a row of crystalline spines, the slick, cold surface a familiar anchor in the vast, silent library of official truths. Each spine was a life, a corporation, a planetary edict, condensed and catalogued. His life was here, too, under the designation Archivist Third Class, designation Beta. Beta. The word was a shield, a carefully constructed lie held together by daily suppressants, a disciplined stillness, and the bland, forgettable scent of neutrality he projected like a second skin. He was efficient. He was invisible. He was safe. The silence was broken by the soft, almost apologetic chime of the summons panel on his console. A single line of text glowed in the sterile blue light. Report to the director's office, immediately. Elian's heart gave a single, hard thud against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The director, Kalen Vance. A name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the sterile cafeterias and transport tubes. The alpha of alphas, the architect of the sector's unyielding efficiency. A man who existed more as a concept than a person. A man Elian had only ever seen as a fleeting, severe silhouette behind the polarized glass of the command spire. He had never been summoned. Not once. Archivists were the ghosts in the machine, their work essential, but their presence unnoticed. To be noticed by the director was to be scrutinized, and to be scrutinized was to risk discovery. He stripped off his archival gloves, his own skin feeling unnervingly warm and alive against the cold air. He checked his reflection in the dark screen of his console. Pale face, dark hair cut to regulation length, grey eyes that revealed nothing. His uniform was immaculate, the grey fabric a perfect, unwrinkled sheath. He looked like every other beta in the directorate. He had to be. He smoothed the front of his tunic, a gesture of calming a tremor that had started in his hands. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, archivist, beta. He repeated the words in his mind, a mantra against the phantom scent of ozone and rain that sometimes haunted the edges of his memory. A ghost of a self he had buried under years of chemical obedience. The walk to the spire was a journey through ascending levels of silence and sterility. The lower levels hummed with the quiet industry of 1,000 other workers, a low thrum of collective existence. But as the grav lift ascended, the sounds fell away, replaced by a profound, pressurized stillness. The air grew colder, sharper. The walls shifted from functional polymer to polished obsidian, reflecting a distorted, elongated version of himself, a wraith moving through a void. The director's office was not an office. It was a precipice. 3 of its 4 walls were solid sheets of smart glass, currently polarized to a deep, intimidating grey, obscuring the city sprawl below. The 4th wall was a living data stream, numbers and charts flowing in silent, hypnotic rivers of light. And in the center of it all, behind a desk that was a single, seamless slab of black marble, sat director Kalen Vance. He did not look up when Elian entered. His attention was fixed on a holographic projection hovering above his desk, his fingers moving with slow, deliberate precision, manipulating threads of light. The air in the room was his. It was charged with a silent, formidable pressure, the ambient scent of a powerful alpha, clean, sharp, like cold steel, and something else, something deeply territorial that made the fine hairs on Elian's arms stand on end. It was a scent that demanded order, that commanded submission. Elian's meticulously constructed beta neutrality felt like a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. He stood before the desk, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on a point just over the director's shoulder. He recited his designation, his voice a practiced monotone. Archivist Elian, 3rd class, reporting as ordered, Director. Kalen's hands stilled. The hologram vanished. Slowly, he lifted his head, and for the first time, Elian was subjected to the full weight of his attention. His eyes were the color of the polarized glass walls, a deep, stormy gray, and they held an unnerving stillness, an analytical calm that seemed to strip away layers of pretense. He was younger than the official portraits suggested, his features sharp and severe, framed by black hair threaded with the barest hint of silver at the temples. He was the system made flesh. Archivist, Kalen said, his voice a low baritone that resonated in the silent room. It was not a greeting. It was a classification. He looked at the datapad on his desk, then back at Elian, his gaze lingering, analytical. Your record is perfect. The word sounded like an accusation. Flawless efficiency ratings, 0 demerits. You have catalogued the entire pre-consortium historical archives, a task that has broken 3 of your predecessors. Elian's throat was dry. I find the work methodical, Director. It suits my temperament. Your temperament, Kalen repeated, the words flat. He leaned back in his chair, the movement slow, controlled. The faint scent of him intensified, a subtle wave of dominance that made Elian's instincts scream. He forced his body to remain placid, to mimic the calm deference of a true beta. The central archive is being restructured. Your current position is being absorbed into the primary data hub. You are being reassigned. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. Reassigned, away from his quiet, anonymous corner of the world, away from the silence and the dust and the safety. I see, he managed, his voice a thin thread. Kalen's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Your new assignment is here, as my administrative aide. Elian's carefully controlled breath hitched. Here, in this room, under this gaze. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. It was a promotion, an honor. It was a death sentence. To be in such close proximity to an alpha of this caliber, day after day, the risk was immeasurable. His suppressants were the best the black market could provide, but they were not infallible. They were designed to withstand normal atmospheric and hormonal triggers, not the constant, oppressive presence of a dominant alpha. Director, Elian began, his mind racing for a plausible beta-like excuse. With respect, my skills are in data retrieval and archival theory. I have no experience in administration. You will learn, Kalen stated. It was not a suggestion. It was a fact. He gestured to a small, unassuming console set against the wall, a stark contrast to his own monolithic desk. Your workstation, your access codes are being generated. You will begin tomorrow at 600. Dismissal. The conversation was over. Elian gave a slight, formal bow, the movement stiff. Yes, Director. He turned to leave, his steps measured, his back straight. He could feel Kalen's eyes on him, a physical weight between his shoulder blades. He was a specimen under a microscope. As his hand reached the door panel, Kalen's voice cut through the silence again, colder this time. Archivist. Elian paused, his hand hovering over the cool metal. Do not disappoint me. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Elian stepped out into the hallway, the sound of it closing behind him like a cell door locking into place. He walked, not seeing the polished floors or the data streams on the walls. All he could feel was the frantic, terrified beat of his own heart, and the chilling certainty that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The ice was cracking. The first week was a study in controlled terror. Elian existed in a state of hyper-awareness, every nerve ending taut, every breath measured. He learned the rhythms of the director's office, the silent language of his moods. A slight steepling of his fingers meant he was deep in strategic thought. A subtle tightening of his jaw signaled rising impatience with a sub-director on the comms. Kalen Vance rarely spoke to him directly. He issued commands to the air, and Elian was expected to execute them. Pull the production logs for Sector Gamma 7. Cross-reference all security dispatches from the Outer Rim colonies for the last cycle. Schedule a threat assessment with the Praetorian Guard. Elian's work was flawless. His hands moved over his console with a fluid, silent efficiency that seemed to impress the director, though Kalen never said as much. His approval was communicated through absence, the absence of criticism, the absence of correction. In the vast, silent expanse of the office, this was the closest thing to praise. Elian's own space was a small island of anonymity. He kept his console meticulously organized, his posture perfect, his gaze always directed at his screen, unless he was being addressed. He was a ghost again. But this time, the machine he haunted was the very heart of the directorate. The proximity to Kalen was a constant, low-grade torture. The Alpha's scent permeated the filtered air, a clean, authoritative fragrance of ozone and cold metal that scraped at the edges of Elian's control. It was a scent that spoke of power held in absolute reserve, of a will that could bend reality. It made the beta in him want to defer, to obey. It made the omega in him want to scream. He doubled his dosage of suppressants, the bitter gel, a familiar caustic ritual each morning and evening. He ate nutrient paste in his small grey apartment, avoiding the communal cafeterias. He minimized all human contact. He became a machine, a conduit for data, his entire being focused on one singular goal: to remain unnoticed, to remain beta. Yet sometimes he would feel Kalen's eyes on him. He wouldn't look up, but he could sense the weight of that gaze, analytical and unnervingly perceptive. It felt as though the director was trying to solve a puzzle, to find a flaw in the perfect, seamless surface Elian presented. One afternoon, while cross-referencing shipping manifests, a data packet flagged as corrupted flashed across Elian's screen. It was old, from 2 decades prior, sealed under a high-level security protocol. The source designation was a string of numbers he didn't recognize. Facility 7. A jolt, cold and sharp, went through him. His fingers froze over the console. Facility 7. The name was a key, unlocking a door in his mind he kept welded shut. For a split second, the sterile office dissolved. He was no longer in the spire. He was in a white room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and sweet. There was a light, too bright, shining down on him. A voice, calm and detached, echoed in the memory. Subject 8 is showing unusual resistance to the bonding simulation. Increase the pheromonal dosage. A phantom ache bloomed behind his eyes, a ghost of 100 needles. Archivist. Kalen's voice sliced through the memory, sharp as glass. Elian flinched, his head snapping up. The director was standing beside his workstation, having crossed the vast space in complete silence. He was so close Elian could see the fine, precise lines of his uniform, could feel the subtle warmth radiating from his body. Kalen's gaze was fixed on Elian's screen, on the flagged data packet. "A problem?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. "No, Director. A corrupted file. Anomaly in the deep archives. I was about to purge it and log the error." He moved to delete the file, but Kalen's hand shot out, his fingers closing over Elian's wrist. The touch was electric, a shock of warmth and strength that burned through the thin fabric of his sleeve and straight into his bloodstream. It was the first time they had made physical contact. Elian's breath caught in his throat. Through the skin-on-skin contact, a wave of something primal and overwhelming crashed against him. Kalen's pure, undiluted, alpha presence. It was immense, a force of nature contained in a human form. It bypassed all his mental shields, all his chemical suppressants, and spoke directly to the terrified Omega cowering in the deepest part of him. He could feel a tremor start in his hand, a dangerous telltale sign of his control slipping. Kalen's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from the screen to Elian's face, then down to where his fingers were wrapped around Elian's wrist. He felt the tremor, the frantic pulse beating against his thumb. For a long moment, he didn't let go. He just watched, his expression unreadable, analytical. "Leave the file," Kalen said, his voice a low command. He released Elian's wrist as abruptly as he had grabbed it. The absence of his touch left Elian's skin feeling cold, exposed. "Transfer it to my private server. I will deal with it." He turned and walked back to his desk without another word, leaving Elian trembling in his wake. Elian's hand was shaking uncontrollably now. He clenched it into a fist, digging his nails into his palm, welcoming the sharp sting of pain as an anchor. He stared at his screen, at the glowing string of numbers, and felt a cold dread wash over him. Facility 7. The director had seen it, and he had seen Elian's reaction. He was no longer just an efficient, invisible archivist. He was an anomaly, a puzzle the director was now determined to solve. The office, once a cage, was beginning to feel like a trap, and the calm, grey eyes of the man across the room were the bars. That night, sleep offered no respite. He dreamt of white rooms and numbered doors, of the scent of rain on hot metal just before the pain began. He woke up gasping, the sheets damp with a cold sweat, his own scent, the one he kept buried, a faint, ghostly trace of ozone and fear in the air of his small apartment. The suppressants were still holding, but he could feel the strain. It was like holding a dam against a rising ocean with nothing but his own 2 hands. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the tide was coming in. The incident with the corrupted file shifted the atmosphere in the office. The silence, once a neutral void, now hummed with unspoken tension. Elian felt Kalen's scrutiny not as a passing glance, but as a constant, low-level scan. The director would pause in his work, his gaze lifting from his data streams to rest on Elian for long, unnerving moments. He said nothing, but Elian could feel the questions radiating from him, sharp and pointed as shards of glass. He was being dissected from a distance. Elian retreated further into himself. His movements became even more precise. His voice, when he was forced to speak, even more monotone. He built his walls higher, reinforced his chemical defenses, and prayed it would be enough. He tried to lose himself in the work, in the endless flow of information. The work was a lifeline, a way to prove his value as a beta, to justify his presence. He began to anticipate Kalen's needs, pulling relevant data streams before the director even asked for them, highlighting potential conflicts in logistical reports, and streamlining the flow of information to his desk with an almost prescient efficiency. Kalen noticed. Of course, he noticed. One evening, long after the rest of the spire had emptied, Elian was collating the day's final security reports. The office was dark, save for the cool blue glow of their two consoles. The smart glass walls were now transparent, revealing the breathtaking vista of the city below, a glittering electric tapestry of light and shadow stretching to the horizon. It was a sterile, beautiful, lonely view. Kalen had been silent for over an hour, his focus absolute as he analyzed troop movements on a holographic map of the outer rim. Suddenly he spoke, his voice startlingly clear in the quiet room. "You were not trained as an administrative aide, archivist." It wasn't a question. Elian kept his eyes on his screen. "No, director. Yet you have the analytical skills of a strategist. You see patterns others miss. You anticipate. That is not the skill set of a cataloger." "The archives teach one to see connections, director," Elian replied, his voice carefully neutral. "History is a series of patterns." "Is it?" Kalen swiveled his chair to face him, the motion slow and deliberate. The holographic map cast a faint blue light on his severe features, making his eyes seem like chips of ice. "Tell me, archivist, what pattern do you see in the data from Facility 7? The name dropped into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Elian's blood ran cold. He had hoped, foolishly, that Kalen had forgotten or dismissed it as a simple data anomaly. "I am not familiar with the facility, director. The file was corrupted. I saw nothing of value." A lie. The moment he had seen the designation, a flood of fragmented data had risen in his mind. Chemical formulas, biometric readings, pain response charts, memories masquerading as data. A flawless record, Kalen mused, his gaze unwavering. A perfect beta designation. And yet, when confronted with a meaningless string of numbers, you react. Your heart rate accelerates. Your respiration changes. Your hand trembles. He had been watching that closely. The thought was terrifying. Kalen was not just observing his work. He was observing him, his physiology, his responses. "I was startled by the security protocol, director. It was a level I had not encountered before." Another lie, smooth and practiced. Kalen was silent for a moment, his grey eyes searching Elian's face for a crack in the facade. Elian met his gaze, forcing his own expression to remain a blank slate, a mask of placid beta indifference. It was a battle of wills, fought in the charged silence between their two desks. Finally, Kalen looked away, turning back to his map. "See that the sector reports are on my desk by 0800, he said, his tone dismissing Elian completely. "And archivist," he added, his back still to him, "do not mistake my patience for ignorance." Elian worked late into the night, long after Kalen had departed in a whisper-quiet grav car. He needed the distraction, the cold comfort of logic and order. But his focus was shattered. The director's words echoed in his mind. Do not mistake my patience for ignorance. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew Elian was hiding something. He was a loose thread in Kalen's perfectly woven tapestry, and it was only a matter of time before he started to pull. As he was preparing to leave, a notification chimed on his console. It was a system-wide alert designated Priority Amber. He opened it. Atmospheric contaminant warning. Level 4 airborne particulate detected in sectors 4 through 9. All personnel advised to engage internal habitat filtration until the all clear is given. Source of contaminant is under investigation. Elian felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The Directorate's environmental controls were absolute. A Level 4 contaminant breach was unheard of. It meant a catastrophic failure somewhere in the city's life support systems. His own apartment was in Sector 6. He quickly checked the chemical composition of the particulate. It was a complex industrial solvent, not biologically hazardous to alphas or betas in low concentrations. But for an omega, even a suppressed one, its effects were unpredictable. Certain airborne compounds could interfere with the chemical matrix of suppressants, weakening them, or worse, causing them to fail entirely. He had to get back to his apartment, to his emergency filtration unit and his backup supply of stabilizers. He shut down his console and practically ran to the grav lift, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The spire was on emergency power. The main lights dimmed, red warning strobes casting long, dancing shadows down the empty corridors. It felt like a tomb. The air already tasted different, sharper, thinner, a metallic tang at the back of his throat. He could feel a strange heat beginning to build deep inside him, a dormant furnace slowly stirring to life. The suppressants were faltering. By the time the grav lift doors opened onto the transit level, a fine sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead and a dizzying wave of heat washed over him. The scent in the air, the metallic tang of the contaminant, seemed to be acting as a catalyst, dissolving the chemical walls he had so carefully constructed. He stumbled towards the transport tube, his vision starting to blur at the edges. A faint fragrance, one he hadn't smelled in years, began to rise from his own skin. It was subtle at first, like the smell of air after a lightning strike. Ozone. And beneath it, the clean, earthy scent of petrichor, of dry earth drinking in the first drops of a coming storm. It was his scent, his true scent, and it was getting stronger. The transport tube was a blur of red emergency lights and distorted reflections. Elian huddled in a corner, his arms wrapped around his torso, trying to physically hold himself together as the foundations of his identity crumbled. The heat inside him was no longer a gentle stirring. It was a rising inferno. His preheat, triggered by the contaminant and the accumulated stress, was crashing over him with a violence he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager in the facility. His skin felt too tight, his nerves like live wires, and his scent, it was pouring from him now, an undeniable, potent declaration of his true nature. Ozone and petrichor, a wild, elemental fragrance completely alien to the sterile, controlled world of the Directorate. It was the scent of a storm breaking. He prayed the tube would be empty, but at the next stop, a pair of Praetorian guards in full armor stepped on, their helmets hiding their faces. They were alphas. He could smell the faint, disciplined scent of them even over the metallic tang in the air. Elian pressed himself further into the corner, pulling his collar up, making himself as small as possible. He held his breath, a futile gesture. One of the guards stiffened, his head turning in Elian's direction like a predator catching a scent on the wind. The other guard noticed his partner's reaction and also turned, his helmet visor glinting in the red light. Elian's blood froze. They couldn't pinpoint him. The scent was filling the small space, a pervasive, confusing signal. But they knew. They knew an unbonded, unscheduled Omega was present. It was a security threat, a biological anomaly that had to be contained. The doors hissed open at his sector station. Elian bolted, pushing past the guards with a surge of desperate strength. He heard a sharp command behind him, the heavy thud of armored boots on the platform. But he didn't look back. He ran. He ran through the deserted corridors of his habitat block, the red emergency strobes making the world a flashing, hellish landscape. His lungs burned, and his vision swam. But the only thought in his mind was the safety of his small grey apartment. The door slid open to his palm print, and he stumbled inside, collapsing against it as it hissed shut. He was safe. For now. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal, gasping for breath, his body racked with tremors. The heat was overwhelming, a fever that clouded his thoughts. His apartment, once a sanctuary of neutrality, was now saturated with his own scent, thick and cloying. He had to get to the stabilizers. He staggered towards the small medical locker in his washroom, his legs unsteady. He fumbled with the latch, his shaking hands making the simple task feel impossible. He finally got it open, his gaze falling on the auto-injectors, filled with the clear, viscous liquid that would hopefully force his biology back into submission. He reached for one, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to brace himself against the wall. His reflection stared back at him from the polished chrome of the locker door. His face was flushed, his pupils dilated, his eyes wild with fever and fear. This was him, the real him. Not the calm, invisible beta, but a terrified Omega at the mercy of his own body. He hated it. He hated the weakness, the loss of control, the biological imperative that made him a target, an asset, a thing to be claimed and controlled. A sharp, insistent chime echoed from his living area. The door. Someone was at his door. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. It was the guards. They had tracked him. He was trapped. The chime sounded again, followed by a solid, authoritative knock. And then a voice, amplified by the door's speaker, cut through the haze of his fever. "Elian, open this door." Kalen. It was Director Vance. How? How had he found him? Elian's mind reeled. The security grid, his transit logs. Of course, the director would have access to everything. He would have been alerted the moment the guards reported an unregistered Omega scent on the transit line originating from the spire. "I know you are in there," Kalen's voice came again, devoid of emotion, a cold statement of fact. "The Praetorians are 2 minutes out. They will not be as patient as I am. Open the door." Elian's choices were a cage, be taken by the guards, sedated, and sent to a reintegration facility, a place that was surely no better than the laboratory he'd escaped. Or open the door to the one man who had already begun to unravel his secrets. He was damned either way. With a shaking hand, he reached out and pressed the release panel. The door slid open with a soft, final hiss. Kalen stood in the hallway, a severe, imposing figure against the flashing red lights. He was in his immaculate uniform, his expression an unreadable mask of control. But his eyes were different. They were darker, the grey hardened to slate, and his pupils were slightly dilated. He was smelling it. He was smelling him. As the scent, thick and unfiltered, washed over the director, Elian saw the first crack in that perfect, icy composure. A muscle in Kalen's jaw jumped. His nostrils flared just once. He took a step into the apartment, and the door slid shut behind him, plunging them into the relative quiet of the room. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his gaze sweeping over the small, sparse apartment, and then settling on Elian, who was still leaning against the washroom doorframe for support. The air between them was electric, thick with unspoken questions and the overwhelming, undeniable truth of Elian's scent. It was a confession he had never intended to make. Kalen took a slow, deliberate step forward. The scent of him, the cold steel and ozone of a dominant alpha, intensified, cutting through the thick sweetness of Elian's own. It was not a comforting presence. It was a challenge, a claim. "Explain," Kalen said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It was not a request for information. It was a demand for the truth. And as Elian looked into those cold, grey eyes, he knew, with a sinking finality, that he had no more lies left to give. The dam had broken. The flood was here. Elian's world had narrowed to the space between them. The flashing red lights from the corridor outside pulsed through his window, painting the room in alternating shades of grey and blood. Kalen stood like a statue carved from granite, his stillness a terrifying counterpoint to the storm raging inside Elian's body. The director's scent, a sharp, clean fragrance of absolute control, was a physical pressure in the room, warring with Elian's own chaotic, desperate scent of ozone and rain. It was a battle of atmospheres, order against chaos, and Elian was losing. "Explain," Kalen repeated, his voice dropping even lower, each syllable a chip of ice. He took another step, closing the distance until he was only an arm's length away, close enough for Elian to see the faint, dark ring around his irises, the telltale sign of an alpha's instincts being triggered. Kalen was fighting for control, just as Elian was. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. "There is nothing to explain," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. The heat of his preheat was making his head spin. "You see what I am." "I see a lie," Kalen bit out, his composure finally cracking, a fissure of raw anger showing through. "I see a security breach of the highest order, an unregistered Omega operating at the very heart of the Directorate. For 7 years. He moved with a sudden, startling speed, his hand lashing out to grip Elian's shoulder. The touch was hard, impersonal, a grip of containment rather than connection. He pushed Elian back against the wall, his larger frame boxing him in. The cool metal of the wall was a shock against Elian's feverish skin. "Why?" Kalen demanded, his face close, his stormy eyes boring into Elian's. The full force of his scent washed over Elian, overwhelming his senses. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. It made the Omega in him want to submit, to bare his throat, to do anything to appease the dominant alpha before him. But the part of him that was just Elian, the part that had survived Facility 7, screamed in defiance. "Why do you think?" Elian shot back, a spark of anger cutting through the fog of his fever. "Look at this world you command, Director. This perfect, sterile cage. What is an Omega here? A broodmare? A political asset to be traded? A biological function to be managed and controlled? I chose to be a person, not a designation." Kalen's grip tightened, his knuckles white. For a moment, Elian thought he might strike him. Instead, a look of profound, cold fury settled on his features. You chose to deceive. You chose to endanger this entire sector with your presence. Your pheromones, should they go unchecked during a full heat, could incite chaos. My life has been checked. Elian's voice cracked, the sound raw with years of repressed pain. It has been checked and catalogued and experimented on since the day I was born. I am not a danger, Director. I am a survivor of the very system you so perfectly uphold. The mention of experiments made Kalen pause. The anger in his eyes was replaced by that familiar, analytical scrutiny. His gaze dropped to Elian's neck, to the place where a mating gland would be. It was smooth, unbitten. Then his eyes flicked to the inside of Elian's wrist, where a faint, silvery network of scars was barely visible in the pulsing light. Scars from IV lines and countless injections. He had seen those scars. He had felt them when he'd grabbed Elian's wrist in the office. Facility 7, Kalen stated, the words cold and flat. It was no longer a question. Elian flinched as if struck. He turned his head away, pressing his cheek against the cold wall, unable to meet that penetrating gaze. The fight went out of him, replaced by a deep, weary shame. He had revealed too much. He was no longer just a liar. He was a specimen, an anomaly from a ghost project. Kalen released his shoulder, stepping back slightly, though the space he gave was marginal. The immediate physical threat receded, replaced by a tense, vibrating silence. He was processing, analyzing, the director reasserting control over the alpha. The contaminant in the air, Kalen said, his tone shifting back to the detached commander. It acted as a catalyst. It destabilized the suppressants, Elian confirmed, his voice dull. He pushed himself off the wall, swaying on his feet. The fever was getting worse, the heat coiling low in his belly, a demanding, insistent ache. He needed the stabilizers. He needed to push this back down, to bury the Omega again before it consumed him completely. He took a stumbling step toward the open medical locker. Kalen moved to block him, his body a solid, unyielding barrier. No, I need them, Elian pleaded, the desperation raw in his voice. The preheat, it's getting worse. And if you stabilize, you go back to being a lie, Kalen countered, his logic as sharp and merciless as ever. I cannot allow that. You are a security variable that must be understood and contained. Contained. The word was a death knell. It was the word they had used at the facility. Subject 8 must be contained for the next phase of trials. A wave of pure, claustrophobic terror washed over him, stronger than the fever, colder than the director's voice. His breath hitched, turning into a ragged gasp. The walls of the small apartment seemed to be closing in. The air was too thick to breathe. He was trapped. He was back in the white room. No, he whispered, shaking his head, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the man in front of him and everything to do with the ghosts inside him. No, not again. Please. His legs gave out. He slid down the wall to the floor, curling into a ball, his arms wrapped around his head as if to ward off a physical blow. A dry, racking sob escaped him, a sound of utter despair. He was broken. The perfect archivist, the invisible beta, was gone, and all that was left was this terrified, trembling creature. For a long moment, Kalen did not move. He simply stood over Elian, a dark, silent sentinel. The sounds of the alert klaxons from the hallway and Elian's own ragged breathing were the only sounds in the room. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Kalen knelt down, not in a gesture of comfort, but in a tactical move, bringing himself to Elian's level. He did not touch him. He simply waited, his presence a heavy, undeniable weight in Elian's shattered world. "The Praetorians are at the door," Kalen said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that cut through Elian's panic. "They will not be gentle. They will sedate you and take you to a holding facility. You will be interrogated, catalogued, and processed according to Directorate Protocol for unregistered dynamics." Elian squeezed his eyes shut, a fresh wave of tremors shaking his body. "Your only other option," Kalen continued, his voice dangerously soft, "is me." The choice was no choice at all. It was an exchange of cages, from the cold, impersonal brutality of the Directorate to the focused, unknown intentions of its most powerful agent. Elian looked up from the floor, his vision blurred with unshed tears, and met Kalen's gaze. In the Director's slate-grey eyes, he saw no pity, no compassion. He saw only a chilling, absolute resolve. It was the gaze of a man who had identified a problem and was now deciding on the most efficient solution. What do you want?" Elian managed to ask, his voice a broken whisper. "I want the truth," Kalen said simply. "I want to understand what you are, where you came from, and why you are a secret the Directorate itself does not know it is keeping. You will come with me. You will remain in my custody until I have those answers." The comm panel on the door chimed, a sharp military signal. "Director Vance," a metallic voice stated, "Praetorian squad at your command. We have the perimeter secured, awaiting your orders to breach." Kalen didn't take his eyes off Elian. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Elian's fate rested on a single word: to be dragged away by faceless soldiers or to walk into the lion's den willingly. He thought of the white rooms, the needles, the cold, detached voices of the scientists. He thought of the 7 years of suffocating silence he had endured to escape that. He could not go back to a place like that. He could not. With a final, shuddering breath, he gave a slow, defeated nod. Kalen held his gaze for a second longer, as if sealing the silent contract between them. Then he rose to his full height and walked to the door, his movements economical and precise. He pressed the comm panel. "Stand down, Captain," he commanded, his voice once again the cold, authoritative instrument of power. "The situation is contained. I have the asset in custody. Return to your posts." "Sir?" The captain's voice crackled back, laced with confusion. "Our orders were to contain an unregistered Omega." "Your orders have been rescinded," Kalen cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "By my authority, clear the corridor, now." There was a pause, then a reluctant, "Yes, Director." Kalen turned back to Elian, who was still huddled on the floor. "Get up," he said. It was not a gentle encouragement. It was an order. Elian used the wall to pull himself to his feet, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of his panic and the relentless, simmering heat of his preheat. He felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped of all his defenses. The Director watched him, his expression unreadable. "My quarters are in the spire. They are secure. You will remain there." He gestured toward the medical locker. "Leave the stabilizers. You are of no use to me if you are hiding." The thought of facing the coming heat without suppressants in the close proximity of this powerful alpha sent a fresh wave of terror through him. It was a biologically calamitous scenario, but the look on Kalen's face told him it was not a negotiation. He was an asset now, a piece of intelligence to be analyzed in its raw, unaltered state. Elian gave a stiff, jerky nod. The journey back to the spire was a surreal nightmare. Kalen led him through the now empty corridors to a private, high-level transport tube Elian hadn't even known existed. They rode in silence, the small space thick with Elian's increasingly potent scent and Kalen's oppressive, controlled presence. Kalen stood with his back to him, staring at the front of the tube, his posture rigid. Elian could see the tension in the line of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was being affected. The pure, unfiltered scent of an Omega in preheat was a potent biological trigger for any alpha, and Elian's, a product of the facility's experiments, seemed to be uniquely powerful. Kalen was fighting a war on two fronts, against the chaos Elian represented to his ordered world, and against the primal instincts raging within his own body. Kalen's quarters were not just a living space, they were a fortress. Located at the very apex of the spire, they were a stark, minimalist expanse of black stone, polished chrome, and glass. It was less a home than a command center, as sterile and controlled as his office, but larger, and somehow more intimidating. The air was filtered to an almost impossible purity, a stark contrast to the thick, pheromone-laden air they'd brought in with them. "The guest suite is through there," Kalen said, gesturing down a short hallway without looking at him. "It has its own filtration unit and a sonic neutralizer. It should help. Help contain the scent. Help manage the problem." Elian nodded numbly and started to walk toward the indicated door. "Elian." Kalen's voice stopped him. He had never used his given name before. It sounded strange, alien, in the director's mouth. Elian turned. Kalen was standing by the great glass wall that overlooked the city, the red emergency lights from below casting his silhouette in a demonic glow. "Do not attempt to leave," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly weight. "There is nowhere in this city you could go where I would not find you." Elian entered the suite, and the door slid shut behind him, the lock engaging with a heavy, definitive click. The room was luxurious by directorate standards, with a bed, a small seating area, and a large washroom. It was also a gilded cage. There were no external comms panels, and the single window was made of the same reinforced smart glass as the rest of the spire, currently opaque. He was a prisoner. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the expensive fabric cool against his skin. The heat inside him was intensifying, the ache in his belly becoming a persistent, demanding throb. His heat was close, maybe hours away, and he was trapped here, with him. A wave of despair washed over him. He had escaped one lab only to find himself in another. His new warden, the most powerful man in the sector. He had spent 7 years building a life of quiet non-existence, and it had been shattered in a single night. He was not Elian, archivist, beta. He was Subject 8. He was an asset. He was a secret. And he belonged to the director now. A low groan escaped his lips as a particularly sharp cramp seized him. He curled up on the bed, pulling a pillow to his chest, and squeezed his eyes shut. The scent of ozone and the coming storm filled the sterile room, a wild, lonely fragrance in a world made of glass and steel. He was waiting for the storm to break, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The hours bled into one another, a feverish, distorted passage of time. The sonic neutralizer in the suite hummed at a low frequency, a constant subliminal pressure that did little to dull the storm inside him. The preheat was a relentless tide, pulling him deeper into a state of pure sensation. His thoughts fragmented logic dissolving in the rising heat. His body ached with a profound, cellular longing he had spent years pretending did not exist. Every nerve ending was on fire, his skin hypersensitive to the slightest touch of the sheets, the soft fabric of his uniform feeling abrasive and restrictive. He stripped down to his thin undershirt and trousers, desperate for some small relief. His scent was a living thing in the room, a thick, heavy presence that clung to every surface. It was a scent of raw need, of biological imperative, a desperate summons. And he knew, with a primal certainty that bypassed conscious thought, that the alpha on the other side of the door could smell it. He could feel Kalen's presence, even through the thick, sound-proofed walls. It was a subtle pressure against the room's atmosphere, a focused point of immense gravity in the void of his isolation. Sometime during the long, dark cycle, the door hissed open. Elian, curled on the bed and half delirious, flinched, his head snapping up. Kalen stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the low light of the main living area. He held a tray. On it was a glass of water and a small plate of nutrient bars. His face was a pale, severe mask in the shadows, his expression unreadable. He did not enter the room. The wave of Elian's scent that hit him was palpable, a physical force. Elian saw the director's shoulders tense, his jaw tighten. He was maintaining his control, but it was costing him. "You need to hydrate," Kalen said, his voice strained, rougher than usual. He set the tray down just inside the door, as if crossing the threshold was a risk he was unwilling to take. "The filtration can't keep up," he stated, a note of something almost like accusation in his tone. Elian just stared at him, his fever-bright eyes wide in his flushed face. He couldn't form a coherent response. The sight of the alpha, so close, was both a threat and a pull. His instincts screamed at him, a confusing torrent of fear and longing. Kalen's gaze lingered on him for a moment, sharp and analytical. Even now, he was observing the progression of the heat, cataloguing the symptoms. Elian was still a specimen. With a final, curt nod, Kalen backed out of the room, and the door slid shut again, the lock clicking into place. Elian crawled off the bed and retrieved the tray. His hands were shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim of the glass. He drank it all in one go, the cool liquid a blessed relief against his parched throat. He ignored the nutrient bars. The thought of food was nauseating. He curled back up on the bed, the brief interaction having drained his remaining energy. The isolation was a unique form of torture. At the facility, they had observed him through one-way glass, their presence a constant, unseen pressure. Here the pressure was singular, known. It was Kalen, and the silence was worse than the clinical chatter of the scientists. It allowed him to feel everything, every wave of heat, every desperate, lonely ache. Memories, unbidden and sharp, began to surface through the fever haze. He remembered the cold gel of the sensor pads on his skin. He remembered the synthetic pheromones they pumped into his room, simulations of alphas trying to gauge his reaction levels. He remembered the pain, a constant companion as they activated and deactivated latent genetic markers they claimed to have discovered in his DNA. Subject 8's pheromonal output is unprecedented. The scent structure is chaotic, unclassifiable. He is not merely an Omega. He is something else, a potential weapon, an asset. He was born in a lab, a creature of design, his very biology a corporate secret. He had never known a real home, a real family. His escape had not been a flight to freedom, but a flight into hiding, into a different kind of cage. He had traded a physical prison for a chemical one. A sob caught in his throat. He had never allowed himself to cry, not since he was a small child in the facility's sterile creche. Crying was a sign of emotional instability, a data point to be noted and corrected. But now, alone in this luxurious prison, with his body betraying him and his past closing in, a single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the sweat on his temple. The heat crested. It crashed over him in a dizzying, blinding wave, and the world dissolved into pure, agonizing sensation. The dull ache became a sharp, demanding need, a physical hollowness that was almost unbearable. He cried out, the sound a low, guttural moan of pain and longing. He writhed on the bed, the sheets twisting around him, his body arching, seeking a relief that wasn't there. This was it, the full, unsuppressed heat, and it was so much worse than he remembered. On the other side of the door, Kalen stood with his back pressed against the cold wall, his eyes shut, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every pained sound Elian made was a physical blow. The scent, it was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It bypassed his conscious mind, his years of discipline and control, and slammed directly into the most primal part of his brain. It was not just the scent of an omega in heat. It was a complex, layered fragrance that spoke of lightning, of rain-soaked earth, of wild, untamed things that had no place in his world of concrete and steel. It was the scent of a breaking storm, and it was calling to every alpha instinct he possessed. His own body was betraying him. His rut, a controlled, biannual event he managed with clinical precision, was being triggered. A low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest, a sound he hadn't made since he was an adolescent. He wanted to break down the door. He wanted to go to the source of that scent, to soothe the pain he could hear in those desperate cries, to claim what was his, to protect. The instinct was so powerful, so overwhelming. It terrified him. He was Kalen Vance, the director. He was control personified. He did not lose control. He pushed himself off the wall and strode into his personal washroom. He turned the water on, as cold as it would go, and plunged his head and hands into the icy spray, gasping as the shock hit him. He stayed there, letting the frigid water sluice over him, trying to drown out the scent and the sounds and the feral, demanding voice of his own biology. He was not an animal. He was the director. And Elian was not a mate. He was a security problem, a puzzle, an asset. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. The words, Elian's words from the apartment, echoed in his mind. He straightened up, water dripping from his hair and face, and stared at his own reflection in the mirror. His eyes were dark, his pupils blown wide. The face staring back at him was that of a stranger, a predator. He had to regain control. He went to his desk, his movements stiff, and pulled up the encrypted file from Facility 7. He had been trying to slice through the security layers for days. Now, fueled by a cold, desperate fury, he redoubled his efforts. He needed to understand. He needed the truth. He worked for hours, the sounds from the guest suite a constant, agonizing distraction. Finally, with a soft chime, the final firewall crumbled. The file opened. It was not a simple personnel record. It was a project summary. Project Chimera. Objective: to engineer a new dynamic. An omega with heightened empathic and sensory abilities, whose pheromonal signature could be weaponized for pacification or terror. He read on, his blood turning to ice. He saw lists of genetic markers, surgical procedures performed on infants, brutal training regimens designed to trigger and control their abilities. And he saw a list of subjects. Subjects 1 through 7 were listed as decommissioned, failed experiments. Subject 8 was listed as escaped. And beside the designation, there was a picture, a grainy black and white image of a small, solemn-looking boy with wide, haunted grey eyes. It was Elian. Kalen stared at the image, at the clinical, monstrous text that described the torture inflicted on this child, and something inside him, something he had thought long dead, fractured. The system he had dedicated his life to, the perfect, ordered world he commanded, was built on a foundation of horrors. And the boy in the picture, the man suffering in the next room, was its victim. A low, agonized sound from the suite broke his trance. It was a sound of pure, unendurable pain. All thought of protocol, of security, of control, shattered. He was on his feet and moving before he had even made a conscious decision. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was a furnace. The scent was a physical presence, so thick he could taste it. Elian was on the bed, thrashing, his body slick with sweat, his eyes squeezed shut in agony. He was lost in the inferno of his heat, completely unaware of Kalen's presence. Kalen's instinct screamed at him, claim, mate, protect. But as he looked at Elian's pain-contorted face, another instinct rose, one he hadn't felt in a very long time. Compassion. He went to the washroom, soaked a towel in cold water, and came back to the bed. He hesitated for only a second. Then he sat on the edge of the mattress and gently, carefully, began to wipe the sweat from Elian's forehead. Elian flinched at the cool touch, his eyes flying open. They were unfocused, glazed with fever, but for a moment they seemed to register Kalen's presence. A soft, confused whimper escaped his lips. "It's all right," Kalen heard himself say, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm here." He continued his gentle ministrations, wiping Elian's face, his neck, his arms. He wasn't the director. He wasn't an alpha fighting his rut. He was just a man, trying to offer some small comfort to another person who was in pain. And in that small, quiet room, amidst the raging storm of biology, it was the most profound choice he had ever made. The cool, damp cloth was an anchor in a sea of fire. It was a point of focus, a small island of relief in the overwhelming sensory chaos of his heat. Elian's delirious mind slowly registered the touch, not as a threat, but as a comfort. He blinked, his vision swimming, and focused on the face above him. It was Kalen, but not the cold, severe director. This version of him was stripped of his authority, his features softened by the dim light, his expression a complex mixture of concern and a deep, visceral pain of his own. His scent was different, too. The sharp, metallic edge of control was gone, replaced by something richer, warmer. The scent of an alpha fighting his own nature, not to dominate, but to protect. Elian's instincts, which had been screaming in a confused agony of need and fear, quieted to a low thrum. The terror receded, leaving only the raw, physical ache of the heat. He leaned into the touch, a small, involuntary movement chasing the coolness of the cloth. Kalen's hand stilled for a moment, his knuckles brushing against Elian's temple. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated connection that made Elian's breath catch. Kalen felt it too. A tremor went through his hand, and he quickly pulled it back, as if burned. He stood up, putting distance between them again. The worst of it will pass in a few hours, he said, his voice strained, clinical. The director was trying to reassert himself. Your physiology is, resilient. He was quoting from the file, from the monstrous text of Project Chimera. The clinical observation was a slap, pulling Elian further from the fever haze. Did you enjoy the reading? Elian asked, his voice a raw rasp. Kalen's composure faltered. He looked away, toward the opaque window. What was done to you was an abomination. It was directorate, policy, Elian countered, the words bitter. It was your system's pursuit of efficiency. I am the result of your perfect order. It was a black site project, unauthorized, buried, Kalen said, his back still to Elian. I never knew. Does it matter? Elian pushed himself up, his arms shaking with the effort. You uphold the system that created it. You are its architect, its enforcer. Kalen turned back to him, and for the first time, Elian saw not anger or analysis, but a profound, haunted look in his eyes. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It matters. He left without another word, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Elian alone with the echo of that quiet, devastating admission. The peak of the heat broke a few hours later, the inferno receding to a slow, simmering burn. The agonizing need subsided, replaced by a deep, boneless exhaustion. Elian fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When he woke, the room was quiet. The fever had broken, leaving him feeling weak and hollowed out, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like days. Sunlight, pale and filtered, was streaming through the window, which was no longer opaque. It revealed the city, awake and moving, oblivious to the storm that had passed in this room. A fresh set of clothes, a simple black tunic and trousers, was folded neatly on the chair. The scent of them was neutral, clean. He showered, the hot water a blessed relief, and dressed. When he emerged from the suite, he found Kalen in the main living area, standing before the great window, a cup of something steaming in his hand. He was dressed in a simple grey uniform, stripped of his director's insignia. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the severe lines of his face seemed deeper. He turned as Elian approached. The city-wide alert has been lifted, Kalen said, his tone measured, businesslike. The contaminant was traced to an industrial accident in the lower sectors. It has been contained. Contained. That word again. Elian said nothing. He walked to the window and stood beside Kalen, not too close, and looked out at the sprawling metropolis below. From this height, it looked perfect, a marvel of engineering and order. A beautiful lie. The records for Project Chimera have been erased, Kalen said quietly, his gaze fixed on the city. Completely. No one will ever know. Except for us, Elian replied, his voice flat. What happens now? Do you send me to a reintegration facility? Assign me a mate to keep me stable? Kalen turned to face him, his expression serious. No. I am giving you a choice. He gestured to a small table where a datapad lay next to a plain, unmarked access card. That card will give you passage on a transport leaving for the Outer Rim territories. It is scheduled to depart in 3 hours. There is a credit chit with enough untraceable currency to start a new life. The territories are chaotic, but they are outside the Directorate's direct control. You would be free. Freedom. It was the one thing he had never dared to hope for. A life without suppressants, without hiding, without fear. A life where he could simply be. He looked from the card to Kalen's face, searching for the catch. And the other choice? Kalen's gaze was intense, unwavering. You stay. You work with me. The things I read in that file, they created something the Directorate was never meant to control. You are not a weapon, but your abilities, your senses, your empathy, they could be used to find the rot in this system, to change it from the inside. It was an insane proposal, to stay here at the heart of the beast and trust the man who was its master, to willingly remain in the cage. Why? Elian asked, the question raw. Why would you do this? I'm a threat to everything you've built. Because you were right, Kalen said, his voice low and laced with a self-loathing that stunned Elian into silence. I am the architect, and I have spent my life perfecting a machine, never looking at the blood in its gears. You have shown me the truth. I can't unsee it. He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. My duty is to the Directorate, but my conscience is now with its victims. A comms panel on Kalen's desk chimed. He ignored it. His entire focus was on Elian. The choice hung in the air between them, heavy and immense. The transport to the outer rim, or the desk in the director's office, escape or revolution, anonymity or purpose. Elian walked over to the table. He picked up the access card, the smooth, cool plastic, a tangible representation of a future he had never imagined. He could disappear. He could be safe. Then he looked at Kalen, at the profound, weary loneliness in the Alpha's eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. He had spent his entire life running, hiding. Perhaps it was time to stop. Perhaps freedom wasn't about escaping the cage, but about transforming it. He set the card back down on the table. The archival system in the spire is inefficient, Elian said, his voice quiet but steady. The cross-referencing protocols are outdated. It's the first thing we should fix. A flicker of something. Surprise, relief, something more complex that Elian couldn't name, passed through Kalen's eyes. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply. But in the quiet, charged space of the room, it felt like the shifting of worlds. The comm panel chimed again, more insistent this time. Kalen walked to his desk and answered it. A man's face appeared on the hollow display, his features sharp and intelligent, his smile thin and cold. He wore the white coat of the Directorate's Science Division. Director Vance, the man said smoothly. My apologies for the intrusion. I am Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm calling from the genomics lab. We've detected a most unusual pheromonal anomaly originating from the spire, a signature I haven't seen in 20 years. I was the head of a research project that produced such a signature. I believe one of my assets has been found. Elian froze. Aris Thorne. The name was a phantom from his nightmares, the calm, detached voice from his memories, the man who had created him. Kalen's face became a mask of ice. He looked from Thorne's smiling face on the screen to Elian, who stood pale and trembling by the window. I'm afraid you are mistaken, Doctor, Kalen said, his voice lethally soft. There are no assets here. Dr. Thorne's smile did not waver, but a cold, calculating light entered his eyes. Director, with all due respect, Subject 8 is Directorate property, a highly valuable and, I might add, highly dangerous piece of research. He is to be returned to my custody immediately. I have the original codicil of acquisition right here. He held up a data wafer, a clear threat. He was a man who knew the labyrinthine laws of the Directorate, a man who knew how to use its own rules as a weapon. Kalen's gaze was glacial. Your codicil is 20 years old, Doctor. Your project was decommissioned. Your property is now a citizen under my protection. The lie was seamless, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who was accustomed to his word being law. Protection? Thorne's laugh was a dry, rustling sound. He does not need protection, Director. He needs containment. You have no idea what he is capable of. His empathic projection, when fully manifested, could destabilize an entire city block. He is not a person. He is a weapon that has not yet been aimed. He is my administrative aide, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word laced with menace. And you, Doctor, are interfering with the office of the sector director. I suggest you return to your laboratory and forget this conversation ever happened. Kalen cut the connection, plunging the room back into silence. The doctor's face vanished, but his presence lingered like a toxic residue. Elian was shaking, not from the fever now, but from a deep, primal terror. Thorne was here. The ghost from his past was real, and he was in the same city. He won't stop, Elian whispered, his voice trembling. He will see this as a challenge. He will use the system, the courts, the Praetorians. He will come for me. Let him try, Kalen said, his voice a low growl. He was no longer the conflicted man struggling with his conscience. He was the director, the predator, and his territory had been threatened. He turned to Elian, his grey eyes blazing with a cold fire. He is right about one thing. We have no idea what you are truly capable of. It is time we found out. The next few days were a blur of intense, focused activity. Kalen sealed the spire, citing a top-level security threat, effectively cutting them off from the rest of the directorate. The office, once a place of silent tension, became their war room. Kalen worked with a terrifying efficiency, pulling up every piece of data he could find on Iris Thorne, his projects, his political connections. He was mapping out his enemy's network, searching for a weakness. Elian, in turn, was tasked with a different kind of research. Kalen had him access the deep archives, searching for any mention of Project Chimera or similar unauthorized genetic programs. But more than that, Kalen was testing him. He would project complex data streams and ask Elian not what they said, but what they felt like. This is a logistics report for a grain shipment, Kalen said, displaying a wall of text and numbers. Tell me what you sense. Elian closed his eyes, pushing past the literal meaning and reaching for the subtext, the emotional residue left by the people who had created the report. It was a skill he had learned in the facility, a way to read the intentions behind the words, a skill he had long suppressed. There's anxiety, Elian said slowly. Fear. The numbers are falsified. The shipment is smaller than reported. The official who signed off on it is being blackmailed. Kalen cross-referenced the official's file. Sure enough, there were unexplained credit transfers to an offshore account. He looked at Elian with a new profound respect. Your empathy, it's a truth serum. They worked side by side, a strange and potent partnership forged in crisis. The dynamic between them had shifted completely. They were no longer director and aide, alpha and omega. They were two minds, two survivors, fighting a common enemy. The proximity, which had once been a source of terror for Elian, was now a strange comfort. Kalen's scent, a constant presence, was no longer a threat. It was an anchor, a steady, protective force in their isolated world. Elian's own scent, now that the heat had passed, had settled into a soft, subtle fragrance of ozone and petrichor, a constant reminder of the truth he no longer had to hide. One evening, exhausted, they sat in silence, the city lights glittering below them. "Why did you stay?" Kalen asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Elian looked at him. "You didn't give me a choice between a cage and freedom," he said. "You gave me a choice between running and fighting. I've been running my whole life. I wanted to see what it felt like to fight back." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Kalen's lips. It was the first time Elian had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his severe features, revealing a hint of the man beneath the director's mask. "I'm glad you did," Kalen said. Their moment of peace was shattered by a jarring, facility-wide shudder. A klaxon began to blare, not the pulsing red of the contaminant alert, but a steady, high-pitched shriek, the spire's breach alarm. "He's here," Kalen said, his voice grim. He was already on his feet, his console flaring to life. "He's bypassed my lockdown. He's using old Praetorian command codes. He's coming up." A schematic of the spire appeared on the screen, showing a single grav lift ascending at high speed. Its destination, the director's office. It carried a dozen life signs. Thorn wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to reclaim his property. Kalen turned to Elian, his face hard, resolute. "There is a private escape pod behind that wall panel. It is shielded, untraceable. It will take you to the sub-levels. You can disappear." It was the same choice as before. Run or fight. Elian looked at the schematic, at the ascending grav lift. He looked at Kalen, who was already pulling a heavy pulse-emitter pistol from a hidden compartment in his desk. He was preparing to make a last stand. For him. "No," Elian said, his voice firm, clear. He walked to the main console, his console, and his fingers flew across the keys. "He thinks I'm a weapon," he said, his eyes glowing with a fierce, newfound intensity. "Let's not disappoint him." He closed his eyes, tuning out the blaring alarm, the flashing lights. He reached out with his senses, not just to the data streams, but to the very systems of the spire itself. He could feel the power conduits, the environmental controls, the communications network. It was all a part of the machine, and he was a part of it too. "The emergency containment system," Elian said, his eyes still closed. "The fire suppression units in the lift shaft. They run on a separate power grid. He won't have thought to disable them." Kalen looked at him, then at the console, understanding dawning on his face. He moved to stand behind Elian, his hand resting on the back of his chair, a silent gesture of trust and support. "What do you need?" Kalen asked. "Divert all available power to the shaft's suppression system," Elian commanded, his voice filled with an authority he had never known he possessed. "And when I tell you, cut the power to the lift." The proximity alert shrieked. The lift was seconds away. "Now," Elian whispered. Kalen slammed his hand down on the power control. The lights in the office flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, lit only by the red glow of the emergency alerts. At the same moment, Elian focused his entire will on the fire suppression system. He didn't just activate it. He pushed, empathically, a wave of pure, concentrated terror down the network. The same terror he had felt in the White Room, the same claustrophobic panic. The system responded to the emotional surge, overloading. In the lift shaft, every nozzle discharged at once, not with foam, but with a thick, cryogaseous agent designed to instantly suffocate any flame. The lift, its power cut, jolted to a halt, and in the same second, was flooded with the sub-zero gas. The 12 life signs on the schematic flickered, and then, one by one, they went out. Silence. The breach alarm cut off. The only sound was the hum of the emergency power. Elian slumped back in his chair, gasping, a profound psychic exhaustion washing over him. Kalen's hand tightened on his shoulder, a steady, grounding pressure. "It's over," Kalen said, his voice filled with awe. Elian shook his head. "No," he said, opening his eyes. "It's just the beginning." On the screen, a single Priority 1 message was flashing. It was from the Directorate High Command. Director Vance, a catastrophic failure has been reported in your Spire's primary lift. Dr. Aris Thorne and his security detail have been lost. You are ordered to report to the Central Committee immediately. Thorne had powerful friends. They had lost a battle, but now the war had begun. The summons from the High Command was not a request. It was an indictment. Kalen and Elian stood in the silent, damaged office. The flashing message on the screen, a harbinger of the new reality they faced. They had won the immediate fight, but in doing so, they had declared war on the clandestine powers that truly ran the Directorate. Thorne was not just a rogue scientist. He was a symptom of the disease, and they had just attacked the infection. The system would now react to protect itself. "They will try to separate us," Kalen said, his voice a low, grim monotone. He was looking at the summons, but his mind was clearly working through a dozen different strategic scenarios. "They will detain me for questioning. They will classify you as a hostile biological entity and hand you over to whatever remains of Thorne's division." "They can't prove anything," Elian countered, though his own heart was pounding with a cold dread. It was a system malfunction, a tragic accident. "They don't need proof," Kalen replied, turning to face him. His grey eyes were dark with the weight of the coming conflict. "They need a scapegoat and a prize. I will be the former, and you will be the latter." The unspoken truth hung between them. As long as they were together, they were strong. Separated, they were vulnerable. Kalen's power was in his authority and strategic mind. Elian's was in his unique, empathic abilities. Together, they were a formidable force. Alone, they were just a disgraced director and a fugitive experiment. "The escape pod," Elian said quietly. "It's still an option. You could say I overpowered you and fled." Kalen's expression hardened. "I am not abandoning you, and I do not run." He walked over to Elian, closing the small space between them. The air was charged, not with the tension of Alpha and Omega, but with the profound, unspoken bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of the last few days. "We knew this was the beginning," Kalen said, his voice softer now, more intimate. "We face it together." He reached out, not to grab or restrain, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He gently cupped Elian's jaw, his thumb stroking softly against his skin. The touch was warm, grounding. It was a question, a promise, and an acknowledgement all at once. Elian leaned into the touch, closing his eyes for a brief moment, drawing strength from the simple, profound contact. When he opened them again, his fear had been replaced by a cold, sharp resolve that mirrored Kalen's. "What's the plan?" he asked. Kalen's lips curved into that rare ghost of a smile. "The best defense is a good offense." The journey to the High Command's central chamber was a silent procession through the heart of the Directorate. They were flanked by 4 Praetorian elites, their silver armor gleaming, their faces hidden behind impassive helmets. They were not an honor guard. They were jailers. Kalen walked with his head held high, his director's uniform immaculate, his expression a mask of cold indifference. Elian walked beside him, a half-step behind, his posture calm, his face betraying nothing of the storm of emotions inside him. He was no longer the frightened archivist. He was the director's aide, a position that, for now, afforded him a thin veneer of legitimacy. He could feel the emotions of the guards around them, suspicion, confusion, and a deep, ingrained deference to Kalen's rank that warred with their current orders. The Central Committee convened in a vast, circular chamber, its walls made of dark, unreflective stone. 12 figures sat on a raised dais, their faces obscured by shadow, their voices filtered through synthesizers, making them sound impersonal and godlike. They were the hidden gears of the machine, the true architects. The synthesized voice of the presiding member echoed in the cavernous space. Director Vance, you stand accused of gross negligence resulting in the death of a senior directorate scientist and his team. You are also accused of harboring an unregistered and potentially hostile biological entity. Kalen stepped forward, his presence commanding even in this intimidating arena. I stand accused of nothing, he stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. I contained a security breach. Dr. Thorne, acting without my authority, attempted to seize control of the spire using illegal command codes. His actions triggered a cascade failure in the lift's emergency systems. The tragedy was of his own making. A convenient explanation, Director, the voice replied. And the entity, the Omega who was with you. My aide, Kalen said smoothly. Archivist Elian. His dynamic was recently reclassified due to a latent genetic marker. All paperwork is in order. A lie, but a plausible one. A lie they would now have to make true. We find this series of events improbable, the voice droned. Your aide will be taken into protective custody by the Science Division for evaluation. You will be suspended from your duties, pending a full investigation. This was it. The moment they would be separated. Elian's blood ran cold, but Kalen had been prepared. I see, Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. It seems my loyalty to the Directorate is being questioned, a loyalty for which I have sacrificed everything. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent chamber. Perhaps then, this is the appropriate time to tender my resignation and to release my personal logs to the public data stream. A collective stir went through the shadowed figures on the dais. The director's personal logs were a Pandora's box, containing every dirty secret, every backroom deal, every compromised decision that kept the directorate running. It was a threat of mutually assured destruction. You would not dare, the voice hissed, the synthesizer failing to hide a note of panic. My logs are encrypted, of course, Kalen continued, as if discussing the weather. But over the last few days, my aide, whose analytical skills with data encryption are, as you will find, quite unprecedented, has been preparing them for dissemination. He is the only one who can halt the release sequence, which is set to trigger automatically should I be detained. He had tied their fates together. If they took Kalen, the system's secrets would be exposed. If they took Elian, Kalen could no longer stop the countdown. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. Elian stood beside him, his heart hammering, playing his part as the silent, indispensable key to this crisis. He focused his empathic sense, pushing a wave of calm, unshakable confidence towards Kalen, a silent thread of support. The silence in the chamber stretched for a long, agonizing minute. The 12 shadowed figures were communicating on a private channel, their fury and indecision a palpable force in the room. Elian could feel their shock, their outrage, and most importantly, their fear. Finally, the presiding voice spoke again, the synthesized tone strained with fury. "Your point is made, Vance. For now, you will be censured, but you will retain your position. The investigation will be handled internally, by your office. But be warned, you have made powerful enemies today. The leash is short." "I have always served the Directorate," Kalen replied smoothly, giving a slight, almost mocking bow. "My loyalty is as ever, beyond question." They were dismissed. They walked from the chamber, the 4 Praetorian elites falling in behind them. Their role once again shifted from jailers to honor guard. They had won. They had faced the heart of the beast and had not flinched. They were still together. Back in the transport tube, ascending to their spire, their fortress, the silence was different. It was not tense or fearful. It was the quiet of a shared victory, of a new beginning. Elian looked at their reflection in the polished wall of the tube. He saw the severe, powerful Alpha and the Iasit, quiet, intense figure beside him. They were not director and aide, not predator and prey. They were partners, allies. Kalen turned to him, his grey eyes searching Elian's face. The crisis was over, for now, but the emotional storm it had unleashed still lingered in the air between them. "Elian," he began, his voice losing its hard, directorial edge. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched Elian's arm. The touch was hesitant, questioning. "Are you all right?" Elian looked at the man beside him, the man who had been his captor, his interrogator, and now his staunchest defender, the man who had seen him at his most vulnerable and had not turned away, the man who had chosen him over the system he had sworn to uphold. A small, genuine smile touched Elian's lips. "I've never been better," he said, and in the quiet hum of the ascending transport, surrounded by the cold steel of the Directorate, he felt, for the very first time in his life, truly free.